Venezuela has long been a focal point of U.S. foreign policy, and recent events, from warships deployed to a $50 million bounty on President Nicolas Maduro, fit a decades-old pattern. The Trump administration claims that all the deployment efforts are to combat narcotics operations in Latin America. But if history taught us anything, it always pays to be doubtful of American allegations, especially that more often than not, there's always a real hidden reason behind any act the US embarks on. This case is no different, and the real hidden reason is none other than oil. The American thirst for Venezuela's oil dates back to the early 20th century. By the 1930s, American companies like Gulf Oil and Standard Oil controlled nearly 98% of Venezuelan production. And even after Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, Washington stayed close because Venezuela remained a chief oil supplier to the US, and things were normal as long as the US was getting its oil. Then the Cold War left its mark, making the sole existence of leftist thought a threat to the United States. This phase ushered in a new age of American covert operations whereby coups were orchestrated and governments were ousted. Venezuela was no different, because the US government attempted to oust then-elected President Hugo Chavez later in 2002. The coup indeed managed to oust Chavez, but only for almost 2 days before his loyal forces restored him. In later years, perceptions of US greed for Venezuelan oil were reinforced through additional coup attempts and attempts to impose a puppet leader who enjoyed no legitimate presidential authority. But desperate US times called for desperate US measures, imposing crushing sanctions on the Latin American country, hitting hard the Venezuelan economy, which relies mainly on oil. In 2019, the US blacklisted PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, and barred all transactions in Venezuela's oil, gold, mining, and banking industries. Then, in 2020, the US provocatively began showing its naval strength off Venezuela's coast, a message that was seen as a clear threat. And now, similar moves are unfolding, with at least 8 US warships sent to the Caribbean and Pacific waters and a hefty bounty on Maduro, all under flimsy pretexts. Behind all the headlines, the core issue remains the same: oil. In the past, the US turned to alternatives when relations soured with Venezuela, but now, under Trump, even relations with allies are not at their best, which forces the US to go on the hunt again. So, what makes the US so obsessed with Venezuelan oil, you might ask? It's the figures on the one hand, because Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, with around 300 billion barrels, exceeding Saudi Arabia's by far. And on the other, it's the nature of the oil that makes a difference. Venezuelan oil, unlike the one in Texas or Saudi Arabia, is considered to be mostly heavy to extra heavy. While this comes with certain drawbacks, it doesn't really pose a problem for the US, since many American Gulf refineries were specifically built to process this type of crude, making the oil essential to keep refineries operating efficiently. And of course, let's not forget the Essequibo region, where massive offshore oil reserves were discovered in recent years. Now, the region is claimed by Guyana, a US ally, but Venezuela has claimed the territory since the 19th century, citing fraudulent ruling. But that's a topic for another day. Anyway, the discovery was so large, it put Guyana on track to become one of the world's fastest growing oil producers. And in late 2023, Venezuelan President Maduro held a referendum in which the people voted overwhelmingly to support asserting sovereignty over the contested region. Another factor to consider is the destination of Venezuelan oil, because if it's not going to the US, it ends up with America's rivals, such as China and Iran. All of these factors increase the temptation for the US to consider putting boots on the ground and risking everything for the so-called black gold. But the question to ask is, how does the US envision this to play out? After all, none of its covert operations or overt strategies have succeeded in Venezuela in the past. So what would make this time any different?